Welcome to webinar 3 of our Diversities and Genders theme for our World Heritage. I'm glad to see you all here. This week focuses on local learning, everyday activism, everyday resistances. What can I do? We have 2 sessions. The first session will run for an hour and 15 minutes, and we'll have 4 speakers, and then we'll have a Q&A. Then we'll have a half an hour break from 4:15 until 4:45. And then in the second session, again, we'll also have 4 speakers and a Q&A, so there'll be plenty of time for discussion. There is Arabic translations available. If you see the link in the chat. And if you can please put your questions in the Q&A box, this is just so that we can keep track of them rather than the chat. And please make it clear who the questions are for as well. That would be great. So to give a kind of a flavour of what the webinar is about, I would say there's a number of speakers coming from different backgrounds and perspectives. So I'm really looking forward to see how they all overlap, because they do in many different ways. Our attempt in this webinar is to address local learnings as a reflection on inclusiveness, and also to understand that the importance of that for dismantling spaces where dominant systems of knowledge reinforce structures of power and inequality. Another theme of this webinar is the many different meanings of resistance. Resistance was and is more than an abstract concept. It's more than physical and emotional struggle. So looking at these many different meanings, I think there's an important value in looking at the actions of stakeholders, but also academics and the projects that they're involved in to address or tackle some of these forms of structural violence. This webinar focuses on the ways that people resist the erasure and exploitation of heritage. So some of the overlapping themes include Palestinian struggles, curating and community-led initiatives, Indigenous knowledge, rights and expression, as well as decolonising constructions of world heritage. Issues linked to colonialism and the coercive power of the nation state is present, I think, throughout all of the presentations. So I would like to introduce our first speaker, Binyamina Efiwa Dadzi. And she's a writer and researcher with an interest in West African cultures, especially Akan and Yoruba. Her current research deals with the impact of missionary presence in 19th century Abeokuta, southwestern Nigeria, focusing on changes in identity and material culture. She's a collections assistant in anthropology at the University of Cambridge, Cambridge's Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, the digital editor of the award-winning open access publication 100 Histories of 100 Worlds in One Object, and a researcher at the Nana Project, where she leads content development with a focus on pre and colonial Ghana. That's a lot. So welcome, Binyamina. Are you ready for your presentation?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Looking at the themes that we are discussing today, I thought of sharing with you all some of the projects that I've been working on that address the idea of local learning, and specifically thinking about what can I do, so what can we individually do to, in a sense, resist erasure of histories of people, and also bring in to the fore the voices of people about whom we often talk, and also whose objects we find in the museum space. And of course, I'm coming to this these questions from the museum heritage perspective, because that's my profession, that's my background, that's my interest. And so what can I do? So thinking about how we can individually contribute to enriching narratives. Last summer, together with Alice Stevenson and Miriam Brucius, we created this open access platform called 100 Histories of 100 Worlds in One Object as a counter narrative to the British Museum's History of the World in 100 Object. And I mean, that project by the BM very much, in a sense, focused on the official narratives about objects. But what we wanted to do is to create a space where people who belong to those cultures from which the objects discussed in the program, people can actually talk about these objects in ways that are personal to them, what those objects mean to them. And so 100 Histories is a digital platform that is, of course, open access, and we tell these stories through essays and also through podcasts. And we have some great podcasts up on the website at the moment. So a little plug there if you want to go and have a look. So that's 100 Histories. Another way we can look at what we can do, and I think this has a specific focus on the idea of local learning, is the work we have been doing with the Nana Project. So the Nana Project was created in 2014 by Kirsty Quatten. She is Ghanaian American, and I joined them last year as a researcher. And the focus of the Nana Project is to tell the story of Ghana through first-hand accounts of our elders. And so a lot of the work we do is focused on interviews, whether audio or video interviews. And the main focus is actually to bring to bear the lived experiences of the people who were there before the creation of the idea of a nation state of Ghana. You know, we often find that in the museum space, we find material culture belonging to the different people that make the country of Ghana. Yet we don't find the voices of the elders and the voices of the people to whom these objects belong to. And so what the HANA project is trying to do is to animate history, animate the sense of history through the experiences of people and to make it tangible and real. So here, so going back to 100 Histories, here you see some of the things I mentioned. So the essays. One of the first essays that we published was The Benin Plaque and Competing Narratives of the African Art by Sani Yakubu Adam. And in that piece, Sani is analyzing the visual meaning of the Benin plaques and trying to unpack the different narratives that they offer, something that you do not necessarily see within the museum space. And one of the first podcasts that we put out was a conversation that I had with a musician from the band Kwampa. So this Akandram was found in Virginia, and it was actually one of the first items that were brought to the BM from the Americas, from Virginia. And this drum was contextualized within the space of grief and suffering, within the context of slavery. And what I wanted to do is to offer another perspective of the use of an Akan drum, because the Akan people, I am Akan, Akan people are living culture, and so it was an opportunity to actually understand the different forms, the different meanings that this museum object has when in context, when used by the people, the cultures that created this object. And so that podcast, I'm having a conversation with Asa from the band Kwampa, and we are talking about the different settings where anakandram is used. And here I have a picture, and this is the latest podcast that we have actually released, and it's from a conference from the summer, and there's a conversation about the role of museums in reshaping object biographies. So that's an example for you. And going to the Nana project, these are some of the things that we have been doing. So you see there an essay. So there's an essay I wrote about a fort in Osu. Osu is a neighborhood in Accra. Accra is the capital of Ghana. I wrote about this fort and some of the conversations I had with the descendants of the Richter family, a Danish Ghanaian family, and as part of the work with the elders that we do video stories. So here you see the story of James Barner. James Barner was one of Ghana's first photographers, and James Barner is I think 91 this year. He'll be 91 in June, I believe. But here he talks about his experience of being a photographer in the Gold Coast, and then later in London being a fashion photographer. And so that gives us a sense of what it meant to be in that space, in that cultural space, before the birth of the nation state. More recently, with another project, we hosted an online festival called Abakosem Festival. So Abakosem, the word Abakosem comes from Chi, which is an Akan language, and it means history. And so we did this history festival. We had different panels with a focus on music, photography, political history, and fashion. We talk about textiles and different forms of photographic images, and also the different histories that we like to remember in Ghana as part of the sort of nation building, the idea of nation building. So going back to the question of what can I do? So I think the answer is you can do what is in front of you. You can address the issues that are in front of you. What resources do you have? What access do you have to people to create spaces of learning that would otherwise not be brought to the forefront? So that's what we are doing with these two projects. So I will stop there, and I'm very happy to answer any questions that might come up later. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That was great. Brilliant. We have our next speaker is Nicola Bird. Nicola Bird was a project manager for the award-winning Multaka Oxford programme at Oxford University's History of Science and Pitt Rivers Museums. Multaka Oxford is an inclusive volunteering programme that values equity through identifying and working towards the aims of the volunteers, community partners, and the museum equally. So welcome you, Nicola.
Thank you, Tony, and hello everyone, and welcome to the seminar. I'm just going to share my presentation. So as Tony said, my name is Nicola Bird, and I was project manager for Multaka Oxford. And that's within my wider role of community engagement in Oxford University's gardens, libraries and museums. So I'm going to take you through a case study today, which was an example of resisting and challenging the power structures that lead to the inequalities, both in the heritage sector and, you know, in our society as a whole. I'm going to give you some examples that that I think the society are ready for, and the museum and heritage sector are ready for, and really behind now. But also I'd like to say I'm going to speak for quite a lot of people today, which isn't usually how I do things, but 10 minutes is not very long, and I'm representing about 70 people who were working on the project, and we're a team that work together. So I just want to let you know, this is Thabo. Thabo comes from Zimbabwe, and I've been working with him for 3 years, and he's an incredible storyteller. He was volunteer on Multaka Oxford, and Multaka means meeting point in Arabic, and it's a programme that provides platforms for intercultural exchange and learning for people who are settling in Oxford, and people who live in Oxford, and for people around the world. But this is the Mambira, and the Mambira is from Zimbabwe. Now, at the Pit Rivers, it's in a case called lamellophones, and it's said it's from Rhodesia. So you can see that's problematic right from the start. Lamellophone is Latin for small metal plate and Greek for small voice. Now, Thabo, when he was doing his tour guiding, he had no idea what a lamellophone was, and certainly doesn't recognise the term Rhodesia for his country. But the Latin name is the only name that's present in the museum and on the database. So if you search for it, you'll only find lamellophone for this particular Zimbabwean instrument. And it's the only one that's been there for 140 years. So this terminology, which is forced into our thinking by colonists and missionaries and oppressors, is a clear demonstration, and for the museum, a representation and propagation of that imperial power itself. So Thabo, he volunteers, and on his tour, he stops at this case and he starts to explain the mislabeling, let's say. The Mambira is an object from his home, his people. He is a Shona from Zimbabwe, and one so intrinsically linked with identity that it just connects with his core, and he's generous and offers this connection to others. So he corrects the mislabeling, and he re-establishes its correct name. And then he explains how missionaries and colonists stripped away language from the Zimbabwean people, replacing it with Latin and Greek. So just the act of denying language and forcing Latin and Greek over local language is one of the methods of oppression and empowerment over people and culture. So alongside this, of course, is the demonization of its spirituality and a rewriting of what the object is, which is interwoven with identity, a rewriting of identity. However, the Mambira might look like an instrument to us, but the rhythms and sounds it produces are interwoven into the very fabric of Zimbabwean culture, present at every social event, at the core of its spirituality. And finally, the Mambira symbolises Zimbabwean resistance and was key in how Zimbabwean people reclaimed their country, culture, identity from the British Empire. Now, Thabo is generous and corrects all of the museum's misteachings on his tour. Allowing people to learn the real name, the complex role, and the symbolic meanings behind this instrument. And I use inverted commas on purpose there. So let's think about the environment this is all in. So this is Oxford University, 2 Oxford University museums, and the Pit Rivers and the History of Science Museum. So I don't really need to start explaining the power structure that resides in this institution, consciously and unconsciously, which prides itself on elitism and has many buildings and statues which are very problematic and, you know, is all over the news for very good reasons. However, Multaka Oxford was about showing the university, the staff, the museums and local people, you know, a completely different approach, one which is about valuing, one and collaborating, and one which we work alongside each other and start listening to people who hold the truths. So, as I said, Multaka means meeting point in Arabic, and it was inspired by the Berlin Multaka programme. It was there to develop intercultural forms of exchange and learning, and to offer a more inclusive approach so people speak for themselves and represent their own culture, faith, and share their knowledge and understanding, and actually start looking about who we listen to and whose voice we record on the database. A process which reveals commonalities rather than the boxes that people put us in. And to be honest, it really speaks to the humanity in us all. So first of all, it highlighted, it led on highlighting everybody's priorities, whereas usually you just hear a museum agenda coming through in these type of institutions. So for partners and people on the programme, for the volunteers, it was actually conceived to provide a platform to challenge the stereotype and dominant narratives of who are refugees and who are asylum seekers, and also gave a space for people to be their myriad of identities, not the one that people give to them. And as I said, to give a realistic view of what our commonalities are and also what our contemporary cultures are. And so they're not fetishized or romanticized and distanced in the past, but one which is actually in the here and now that speaks to that depth of past. And also it was all about rethinking what is community. As our community's descriptions of what separates us, or actually our community's what joins us and what we have in common. So for many, it was also a structured programme. So as people who were settling in Oxford could find a development of skills, identify the skills they have, share the skills they have, and actually start to unpick the British discourse of organisation cultures, recruitment, filling in CVs. So we were all focusing on transferable skills, everything that we were learning as a team. But for the museum, the museum agendas was about taking multiple perspectives, looking at a global approach to how they interpret their objects, how they share the knowledge, how they engage the public with this knowledge and with its collections, and also to get a deeper understanding of what objects really mean, and how to include this in displays and on the database and take a more inclusive approach to public engagement. It also led on when you pay people for the skills and when it's a volunteer programme. For a long time, community engagement is diversity, and you expect a lot of people basically to pay to work for free under partnerships or communities. So we looked at if it was essential skills, we would pay people. If it was volunteering, we would make sure there was equity and mutual benefit, understanding priorities and putting in a structured learning programme which had reviews and thinking about where people wanted to go next. So what I always say is you can't really understand Multaka until you experience it, because it really affects you deep inside. So what we had to do is set up a structure to allow lots of people to experience Multaka, not just hear about it or theorise about it, but actually one which allowed so many people to come on this journey with us as agents and rather than recipients. So my role before I joined the museums was based in Oxford's community. So I knew about all of the impactful people and organisation, and Oxford just is rich as many other cities are. But what I think is important is to think about how you develop a project to allow this. And one, it's all about structure, not outcomes. It's all about processing and allowing that process to be the outcome, a process of learning, a process which enables change rather than celebrates its finishing all the time. So there was exhibitions and activities and events. Everything was set up so it was co-researched, co-planned, co-delivered, and even co-evaluated. We even trained up a team of volunteer evaluators. So everyone was part of the process, and the identification and ownership was a huge team. There were no them and us in Multaka. It was all us and we. And what was really important is actually the structure where people can challenge and we can respond as a bigger team. So we were governed by a community advisory group. And that was really helpful. And that had people questioning, you know, whose agenda is this? Why are you using the word refugee? Why are you putting that term on me? So we were constantly listening and evaluating what we were doing. What was also a key point of what we did was our staff recruitment. So our recruitment reflected the work we were doing. We valued experience as well as professional experience. And we allowed ourselves to allow those to intertwine. Who we are as well as our profession is what we are bringing. So actually we did have a team which were really experienced in multicultural, working with multicultural groups, experience of forced migration, whether it be as a refugee or an economic migrant, experience of dual identity and dual heritage, and experience of supporting volunteers. And this is how we've all brought our skills to the table and worked as a project team. So I'll just give you another example so you can experience Multaka again. This is Janan. Janan is from Syria. And she's been with Multaka, she was with Multaka for 2 years, and she was, you know, organised family events and tours and exhibitions, and she was a digital researcher. And in the History of Science Museum, she came across this Japanese net ski, and it's one which depicts a midwife. Now, the beautiful thing that Janan offered the people on her tour was the connection between the Arabic prayer of Al-Athan and Japanese net ski. So she then told the tour, the people on the tour, how she was present at her brother's birth and she saw the midwife whisper the Al-Athan into both of his ears. And actually the connection that you had between the people on the tour is what Multaka is, that platform, that meeting point of who we are and the experiences that we have. But it's not an easy path, as you can imagine. It's Oxford University, there's lots of power structures in there. This type of work is usually based on short-term contracts. People only have short-term contracts, and this is really disempowering for staff that are really committed to change. It doesn't usually have advocacy in more senior meetings or in the visitors board. So we don't get this type of work being advocated at the time that we need it. However, I just want to say my last point is,
go ahead.
What is key is the Multaka team and our allies and the staff and volunteers, what we've learned is actually this is what we do is important, and we need to lead on what's important and allow the heritage sector to start catching up with us.
Very good point. Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Nicola. Let me introduce Dr. Byung. Hello, so our third speaker is Dr. Byung Ismahasan, and Byung is an Indigenous Kulin Nation curator, artist and researcher. He received a PhD in curating at the University of Essex. His research involves issues of Indigenous curatorial practice and decolonial aesthetics, focusing on the curation of Taiwanese Indigenous contemporary art and building on the themes of articulation of performative indigeneity and Indigenous creative sovereignty. Byung, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Byung Ismahasan. Uninaga Mihumisan, Sakin Hai Byung Ismahasan, Takisaki Sha Taiwan to Dagaujin to Namasha to Bunun. I spoke my Bunun languages. My name is Byung Ismahasan. I came from the Kanoa community in Namasha, in the southern part of Taiwan. I'm staying with my ancestor in this space to share the beauties of our culture and art. On the behalf of the Taiwanese indigenous people, it is greatest honors to share my forthcoming exhibition, Resurgence and Solidarity, Indigenous Taiwanese Woman Art, just happened this coming Saturday at Taiwan Indigenous People Cultural Part. And it is also my honor to have to collaborate with the British Council and the border crossings origin, the Festival of First Nation in London for the digital curation. At the core of this exhibition is the need for women's togetherness, the togetherness as the live protest and togetherness as a methodology, whether that be curatorial approach or personal philosophy. Decolonizing indigenous Taiwanese contemporary art must include privileging the voices and input of indigenous women's artists. By bringing together the voices of respected elders and 3 very powerful women artists, as you can see in this slide, this exhibition generates togetherness through trans-indigenous culture exchanges across generations. It is about the transmissions of knowledge between people, land, and the river. Taiwanese indigenous people and group, currently the 16 official recognized indigenous people are this, and I belong to Bunun, Ataya, and Gurmagan Nation. And at the core of my approach is indigenous cultural protest, which has served as a principal means for responding to Bunun ontological relationship with Maluskun Masdala. The Bunun concept of coexistence, which means land, which also means humility and fear towards earth, and light in many First Nation cultures, the process of grounded relationship both culturally and spiritually. And visualizing sovereignty in an indigenous sense is similarly connecting to land. In my Bunun language is Dala. In my practice-based research, the word sovereignty, appropriate from English languages, those become the critical source of self-determination for indigenous people globally, and has been used as corrective strategies by indigenous people to counter the ongoing dispossession of our sources and land. In the Bunun context, the phrase Maluskun Dalas can be defined as absolutely sovereignty. Today, the right of the woman, the production of elders, the environmental concern are critical for many indigenous Taiwanese women. There is a powerful sense of their search for new unexplored possibility as they strive to carve out a place for themselves and escape or departures from the familiar and the constraint of the COVID-19 pandemic. They deliberately located themselves in the foreign or allied environment with and with an awareness of their differences, finding connection, experimenting with intensity. The artists in this exhibition, all of whom identified as feminists, make these journals from the specific starting point of the Native community experience and their sovereign word and concern about environmental reciprocity. At the core of this exhibition is the need for women togetherness, because we need to unite it. Women have long been the driven creative force behind indigenous Taiwanese art, yet their individual contribution has been largely unrecognized. The treaties and autonomy, the representation of entire culture. The working through togetherness, this exhibition aims to gather the physical experience and life story of women artists to share their viewpoint in creative ways, to throw new light on criminal concern and to discuss new concern in ways informed by tradition. In the global space of disorder, decline, obscurity, and alienation, it initiated an alternative culture of way of the being together. As you can see, the first artist is Milay Mafaliu, belong to a Katatibu community of Taidong County in the eastern Taiwan. In Katatibu community, where Milay grew up, the story of each year represents the passage through life, the sowing and harvest festival that follow the growth of the millet, the vernal sacrifice that accompanies the disappearances of life, recording the growth and the passing of life year after year. And looking back on yourself, the clue of the memory that comes slowly through your hand, the living, the try for the city, studying the foreign country in Japan and the land environment, the wandering on land where there is nothing. As indigenous curators, I have the clear interest in ensuring that my Kyoto approach departs from ethnography mode of display. As such, I ask, what is the nature of ethno-accepted? What can it tell us about ourselves as natives? Those I have an interest in unveiling the connection leading back to Taiwanese indigenous people and contemporary art in order to echo the major components of interaction of artistic collaboration and conversation associated with indigenous environmental values in the variety of indigenous to indigenous relationship. I maintain an indigenous essentialism as a counterpart to stretch the production of the knowledge about Kyoto decoloniality as established curators of the First Nation from Canada, Wanda Notabesh search, world-like return, resurging and rewriting old have embedded in them a colonial idea of time where we have not had continuity and contemporarity or even modernity, even if otherwise than as European vision. Resurgent and Solidarity Indigenous Taiwanese Woman Arts exhibition connect any process of decolonization of indigenous curatorial practice to question what the place of accepted in the colonial method of power, a machine that generates injustice, devolves, silence at all levels by articulated performative euthanasia and visualizing sovereignty of an indigenous land, the female activism, and their body resistant culture and community. Anchored in this idea, Ali Sapa, which means a rugged rock cliff in the Lukai Nation, made by Alain Luluand. This word built on things of indigenous way of knowing and address the key concept of relatedness, continuity, and activation. And relatedness is the notion that all things on the earth are our relation, a fundamental idea to indigenous worldview. That continuity is relatedness across generation, history, and our future. And this will depict the path along with Alain Luluand have returned to the old Kuchapuan community in recent years, and she feel recalled. She drove the deepest thought of her heart to go home. She evoked her Luka ancestor rooted in his land. During the typhoon miracle in August 2009, the new Kuchapuan community once again experienced catastrophes as their tribal landscape were destroyed. After the landslide on the mountain, the Lukai people tried to return to old Kuchapuan. The road was blocked, and so they have to open another path. The destroyed road is still there. After the typhoon, it gave life. And this word President Luluand returned to old Kuchapuan both the physical and emotional experience, crying in response to the face of the earth, unheard petitioners climbed to the peak. Another word is Luluand inner word, looked like a recycling factory and assembly line. She has been the West collectors exploring the trajectories of her life. Each time she moved or emigrated, the border crossing and encounters. She took her stuff, found cardboard boxes carefully and checked them during the process. She realized that each of her personal decisions in the past would be viewed like the ritual as destined were to be moved from old Kutapuan and old Medest to a new one where she lived in the community of Dulan in the eastern part of Taiwan. And that elevation is about the present and how an indigenous artist intimated a space, an object, or an idea through sensational experience, video, or viewer engagement. Taiwanese indigenous Lukai Nation artist Alain Luluant, she believed in the ability of an installation to have its own languages, an own way of letting us something new, also ways rose out of Luluan inner world and consciousness and facing the chaotic situation against COVID-19 pandemic. I think there is one thing that everyone in this online room and platform will really stand by its need for that togetherness. The togetherness is a practice, togetherness as a methodology. So bring together of the very feature of the curatorial group is about curating togetherness. Finally, I would say togetherness as actually the fundamental core values of the being indigenous curators. And finally, the third artist, Gurmagan, belong to the Paiwan Nation from Dasha community of the Pingtung County in the southern part of Taiwan. And this word, through the rubbling, our right hand touches the material itself. In the process of ink rolling and printing, both eyes must pay attention to the relationship between the material and the paper at the same time. This kind of relationship is like her life, always paying attention to her Paiwan noble identity, cultural survival and values at the same time. This is the diverse and the multitasking extent, and it's always quite difficult. And Robin carried the definition of her life and returned to the original hometown, the Paraland community, which is her hometown and her cultural heritage and all her childhood memory. After the Typhoon Morocco in August 2009, we were not allowed to return back to our original community. It is impossible for us to tear it down and take it down the mountain. So what can we do? By rubbling the legend that trace be produced through her hand and brought down the mountain and put into the world, it may be a more contextual creative thinking. Another word is the tribal landscape, which Gurmagan tried to weaving landscape of her original community. And final word is, this is the documentary installation which collaborate with me. And this word represents the creative work of Gurmagan from the Paiwan Nation. At the core of this installation is indigenous weaving technique, which is a deep conceptual underpinning, which has served as the principal means for responding to Paiwan Nation relationship with the melodic good. The Paiwan concept of the textual winding, which also means humanity and activation and feel toward inner spirituality and possess a grounded connectivity, both culturally and spirituality. This way of understanding of the self in relation to land, spirit, and common to many indigenous First Nation culture. And the installation depicts the cultural influences and trans-contextual dialogue of the Melaligat and its evaluation with Gurmagan word based on her multiple identity. And finally, this word attempt to explore the artistic process, assumption, shift, and expansion from the creation of the personal experience, life memory, and the culture change. It asks how time and history may be compressed and condensed in the spatial mode of woman united through the life experience in the generated bodies. The question about disappearance of class and culture, the woman right to speak, and environmental care are of the vital importance to many female artists. They are familiar with trauma and their art offer at once a response and an escape. And this exhibition have four sub-themes: environmental reciprocity, cultural landscape to turn after healing, and the power of object. And this exhibition interrogates these themes through their careful, the deep exploration through art, offering a new perspective through the activation of female artistic united. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Byung. That was great. That was really, really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the next speaker, Paul Edward Montgomery Ramirez. And he is a Mangay Chorotega archaeologist, and he's a decolonial heritage specialist and public archaeologist. He's a member of the Indigenous Council of the World Archaeological Congress, and he works on issues of presenting, representing and decolonizing heritage in media, tourism, museums and education. He's also focused on delivering decolonial options to heritage practice, sustainable futures in tourism, food sovereignty and Indigenous rights. And he has a PhD from the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. So welcome, Paul Edward.
Great. Okay, so there is my force of habit intro to me piece that I have right there. So yeah, I am Paul Edward Montgomery Ramirez, and I'm going to be talking about two different cases that I work on as a researcher myself. You know, so the good old-fashioned academic articles and all of that, and as well with a new organization that I've started last year, so it's still very much in its infancy, but we're going as quickly as we can. It's called iloazul.org. So Ilo Azul means the blue thread. And if you like anything that I have to say, you can always follow me, talk to me on Twitter. So the two cases that I'm going to be talking about are in the country of Nicaragua, where I am from as a Mangay Chorotega person, and also the fine state of Ohio, which is where I spent a significant portion of my life and is where I'm working at with Cleveland State University currently. So let us start in. So here's an image from one of Nicaragua's two UNESCO World Heritage Sites. This is at León Viejo, which was an old colonial settlement from the very early colonial period in Nicaragua. It was basically covered by volcanic ash because the settlers, they, well, I guess decided to live too close to one of the volcanoes in Nicaragua. So one of the things that made this place special for UNESCO is that it is one of the only examples that we have of this incredibly early period of colonization. And so this site as well is used very often by, you know, succeeding Nicaraguan governments as an emblem of the early colonial experience. But not only that, but there is a celebration. This is a type of performance called El Huayhuense, which means roughly the wise man or the wise one. And this celebration takes place at the second half of January every year. And it's a street performance that has undergone a lot of interpretations over the years. And these interpretations have gone anywhere from talking about how this is a play about deceiving colonial authorities, to how it's a play about the mixing of indigenous and Spanish traditions and people. Mestizaje is one of the words that we use, which literally means the mixing. And the interesting thing about El Huayhuense is that in reality, as my traditions have shown and as my research shows, that El Huayhuense isn't realistically connected to either of those things, but it is more appropriately understood as indigenous resistance within plain sight. Facets about this story and how it goes basically show these indigenous people showing utter contempt for Spanish authorities, resisting them, eventually tricking them, and then riding, quite literally riding off into the sunset, which at that time, it was illegal for indigenous people to ride horses. And yet, if this play, which is the earliest that we can see this form of the play, is from, we see 17, and then it was finally written down in the 1800s. And it was still something that was not legal for indigenous people to do. And in fact, well into the 1800s, the performance itself was periodically outlawed by the Nicaraguan government. So the story that this is about the creation of the Nicaraguan people doesn't actually really stand up to a lot of scrutiny. But a strong facet about this is the resistance, which that has been adopted by many people within Nicaragua, be those indigenous people, be those people who are resisting against American imperialism, Spanish imperialism. And so this play has then taken on a much bigger form, so much so that it is actually, as of 2008, considered a part of the Unesco's intangible cultural heritage. So we see this play being used in very official ways. On the left-hand side, we see the play El Huayhuense being acted out at a state-sponsored and a state-led cultural event. Actually, the son of the president basically put on this event, and El Huayhuense showed up. Now, this also comes within a facet, an aspect of, in Nicaragua, these Chorotega traditions, which El Huayhuense comes from Chorotega people. We see within Nicaragua's national drive for tourism, mixing of these different kinds of performances. So we see here what is supposed to be El Huayhuense, or is forwarded as being El Huayhuense, but we also see other performances. We see in the front is either Diablito or someone from Aguizotes, which that is performed in October. Meanwhile, El Huayhuense is traditionally performed at the end of January. So we see an incredible amount of homogenization that occurs with how these different cultural aspects are shown. We also see this folds into how we talk about indigeneity within Nicaragua. In order to advance something as being appropriately indigenous, very often people have to go very far to show themselves as being a stereotype of what is indigenous, as we can see with this person, the so-called the High Chief of Managua on the right-hand side. Of course, indigenous people in Nicaragua never actually looked like that. That was not how indigenous people dressed, but that's what people come to imagine and expect. Now, we also see that indigenous people this is an image of the Council of Elders from, what would be my community of Munimbo, participating in the creation in some kind of cultural festival, some state-sponsored cultural festival. And within this, we have to respect that just the very fact of surviving is a form of resistance. Indigenous communities can have intersecting agendas with the state that is appropriating their culture, in order to help meet their communal needs. But in the end, realistically, we need to look at visibility. The more that people can actually look at you, look at your society, and recognize that Indigenous people do exist, that can open up new options. And so really quickly, with the last tiny bit of time that I have, going to my case in the state of Ohio. So Cleveland baseball in Ohio has a, very infamous caricature. That's the Cleveland Indians with Chief Wahoo as the mascot. Now, thankfully, as of next year, they are going to be dropping the name and dropping the logo as well. Now, this met with a lot of resistance. Kind of the story that the baseball club has is that a man named Louis Sokolaxis was the origin for this name of the Indians. However, if we actually look up the history of that, if we do research on that, we can very clearly see how untrue that is. There was no, at any point, actual move to honor this man, this Indigenous man who played for the Cleveland Spiders at the time in the late 1800s. But realistically, what we can see is that this name change came around basically piggybacking off the success of the Boston Braves, who became the top team in 1914. So the Cleveland Indians got that name to try and gain the same exact good luck that the Braves name got Boston. And throughout Sokolaxis's career, we see how racially this man was. Either he was doing well and we decide that we need to talk about him in terms of genocide, or he's not doing so well and suddenly he becomes the stereotype of a drunken Indian. So the sad thing is, though, most people in the city of Cleveland who have been surveyed back in 2018, they did not actually think that Chief Wahoo and the Cleveland Indians was remotely disrespectful. About 48% of people interviewed by universities said that they didn't think that it was disrespectful at all. And the fact of the matter is, every single academic study that has been done on psychology and impacts show very clearly that these mascots do have an incredibly negative impact on Indigenous people. And not only that, but they also teach non-Indigenous people they give them very bad foundations of understanding of Indigenous people. But this is all wound up in a idea of whose heritage this is. The Cleveland Indians, this is a part of Cleveland, this is a part of Northeast Ohio. So this is a part of Ohio heritage. But at the same time, this completely undermines and forgets that there's an incredibly wealthy amount of heritage of actual Indigenous stories in the state of Ohio, from prehistory to the early colonial period. and even into the American War of Independence. The state of Ohio, what's now the state of Ohio, was an incredibly active part during that conflict, and a very grim part of that conflict with the massacre at Gnadenhutten, where 96 Lenape were massacred just for being Native American. The city of Cleveland also has the gravesite of a chieftain named Jaquesot, who died in 1844. And he's buried in a historic cemetery. Now, more close than that, and we also have in that same cemetery an incredibly famous man who went by the name Chief Thunderwater, who organized one of the very first indigenous rights organizations in the United States, the Supreme Council of Indian Nations. And through this and the Thunderwater movement, he basically worked towards legal rights, education, access to healthcare for indigenous people. And this then led to the foundation of organizations like the American Indian Movement in the 1960s. So Northeast Ohio and Cleveland has an incredible wealth of indigenous history and indigenous heritage that it can talk about. So Hilo Azul, the part of this work is to talk about these, is to connect with different locations within Ohio in order to talk about actual indigenous heritages as in place of this horrible and racist caricature that has been forwarded for about 100 years now. And work in Nicaragua is also going towards talking about a move away from caricatures of the indigenous and towards a conversation that is a little more, that is much more than headdresses, that's much more than the stereotype of what we think we mean when we talk about indigenous people. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul Edward. That was brilliant. That was wonderful. We're going to go to the Q&A now, I think.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to read the first question. Is for Benjamina. Thank you for your excellent talk and for sharing such an interesting project. You say that in response to the question of what should we do in everyday resistance, that we should utilize what is in front of us to create learning spaces, often the most marginalized of people, whose stories are the most erased, don't have the means for this. What can we do to support them without speaking over them?
Yes, great. Thank you. That's an excellent question. And that's something that personally I spend a lot of time thinking about. So first of all, recognizing that the knowledge that people are sharing is valuable and people deserve to be compensated, or there's need to create spaces of equity. So Nicola actually mentioned some of that during her talk regarding the work that they're doing. So for example, with 100 History, one of the things, so let me go back a second. I think for people who find themselves in positions of privilege like myself, working for institutions and working for projects that can have access to funding or have the platform to seek funding, it's important to draw people that do not have that access. It's important to draw them in. So using 100 Histories as an example, the podcast I recorded with Kwampa, the musician, one thing that we did as part of that project was to commission sound for our podcast series. and pay him for that commission, and also make ourselves available for any support that he might need. Make our networks available for any resources that he might need. For example, with the Nana Project for the Abakusin Festival, all the panelists and the elders that came to speak for us, for the audience that we draw, we paid them an honorarium. And we have also made ourselves available if they need any resources. As a researcher, I have access to libraries, which are behind paywalls. I have access to journal articles, to photographs about themselves, which they don't have access to because those items are copyrighted by institutions and other organizations. And so I think when I talk about start from where you are, start from your own, what I really mean is, what resources do you have access to? How can you create access with what you have to expand the room for others to enter?
Thank you, Benjamina. That is really a good insight. How do we talk with other people who maybe doesn't have the possibility to express themselves? I think Nicola had a question, but she answered through the chat to Mohammed. I think Mohammed is satisfied with the answer, so we will go forward to thank you, Nicola. We have a question for Paul Edward here. And the question is, Viveiros de Castro is a Brazilian anthropologist, as you might know. He talks about how post-colonial resistance should create perspective. What are your thoughts about this? How can we create this perspective, or how your work is creating this perspective?
Right. So one of the major facets about Chorotega identity is just the depth of how it has been co-opted by the nation building of Nicaragua. So much so that it kind of, you're presenting yourself as an indigenous person, as an indigenous Chorotega person. Most people would look at you and say, oh, they're being a proud Nicaraguan person, which, I mean, that might be true in some respects, but they're two very separate things. And so there is a need to identify as being indigenous, as being a member of those communities, without, as I showed, making a caricature out of oneself, out of making a stereotype that people are expecting. So these different views, of course, that's how a lot of indigenous people in Nicaragua and in Costa Rica as well have been approaching this, is they have to look the game of what people expect of an indigenous person, which in the end is kind of double-edged, because it feeds stereotypes, it feeds that settler perception and perspective, while at the same time, yeah, sure, it does show difference, but it also feeds into bad stereotypes. It feeds into this unreal image of indigenous people. And so the work that I'm looking at doing, and that I am pursuing currently, it revolves around language revival. It revolves around inserting certain elements that are indigenous, and adding more layers onto it without stepping into the realm of caricature. Like in El Huayhuense, one of the big images is of a donkey. Well, in reality, it's not actually a donkey. It's probably a deer. So adding these extra elements into these performances can stress a perception and the perspective of Indigenous people without going too far into a stereotype. I hope that answered.
Yes, thank you, Paul Edward. Now we have a question for Afua, for Benjamina. Afua, this question comes from Toki Brown, which is our co-convener, and she wants to know, what are the consequences of heritage erasure, destruction and exploitation?
That's a big question. So, you know, talking specifically about some of the issues I encounter, I was about a month ago, actually. So just to give you an example, about a month ago, I was in this this seminar, online seminar, about a project that my institution was part of, and we had people discussing, we had researchers discussing what it means to them that their cultural heritage, their material culture, is, you know, located in a foreign land, and what that distance means to them. And there was this this lady that talked about how she was unable to show her son what it means to become a man through the performance of their heritage, because the item for that performance, so a shield, that item is in a British museum. And she got very emotional. And I share this story because oftentimes, you know, we are in a situation of incredible privilege. You know, we get to sit here and get together and talk about, you know, heritage and you know, destruction of heritage, and, you know, how we can help, what we can do. But really, the practical consequence of this inheritance is the fact that people are unable to become their full self, because they are unable to encounter their ancestors through the inheritance that their ancestors left them. And so for this woman, that meant that she was unable as a mother to show her son what his forefathers left for him. And that is incredibly painful for her. And so to answer Dr. Brown's question of, you know, what is the consequence of erasure of heritage, this is the consequence. People are unable to connect with their past in a way that is meaningful to them. And that can have a deep impact on their life experience and the way they see themselves and the way they navigate the world. And so it's deeply troubling in that sense.
Thank you, Benjamina. Now I have a question from Lisa Ravna Finborg. Thank you, Lisa, for being part of the webinar. This question is for Bayang, and it's creating from an Indigenous perspective. What would you say is important to keep in mind that separates the process from one centered within a known Indigenous context?
Thank you, Lisa, for your question. And I know Lisa is a Summit artist, a Summit curators from based in Oslo, and she is the co-curators for Summit Pavilion for Nas Venice Biennale last year. And as my role of the Indigenous curators, I think it is to ensure that we bridge attitudinal and knowledge-based gulf between Indigenous and non-Indigenous in culture appropriate and generates waste. And one way to confronting my own responsibility as Indigenous curators is to establish the separatist, which I mean Indigenous sovereign spaces for the presentation of indigenous contemporary art. Why I would like to say that normally, especially in Taiwan, there's a lot of non-indigenous scholars forgot to respect our land before opening the exhibition. And for extent, I'm the Bunu Nation. I collaborate with 3 different nation artists, Binu Mayan and Lukai and the Paiwan Nation. Firstly, my strategies is, my approach is to meet their elders and to meet their family members in order to connect together, because this is my own experience. And a large part of my curation aspire to create a detailed localized art history and naturalize the idea to create the culturally relation space and of indigeneity. And I think the connectivity and the togetherness of connect between the curators and artists, this will influences your atmospheres of your curatorial space and curatorial practice. I think this is very important. As indigenous curators, you need to bring, you need to take the responsibility and do the action to say our word. For example, my forthcoming exhibition this Saturday, and I'm going to present our sovereign word of Taiwanese Taiwan indigenous artists to the world, because the women voices, just like the drop of waters, and the voices of the group of the women can be condensed into the power of the river, and the river is connecting to our First Nation culture. Thank you.
Thank you, Bayan. And now we have another question from
just to interrupt, sorry, Paloma, quickly, but just to say that the captions will be ending now. This is sort of when we were going to have a half an hour break. If you're happy to talk a bit more, to ask questions, then by all means continue. But yes, we were hoping to have a little bit of a break before the second one. Yeah, you decide.
Yes, the last question is from Professor Sofia Labari, which is the organizer of our World Heritage Diversities and Genders themes. And this is a question for Paul Edward. Indigenous people have used stereotypes for their own benefits, like for tourism. What should be done to ensure that Indigenous people have socio-economic benefits without having to stereotype themselves?
Right, yeah, that's a pretty difficult question. Because yeah, I mean, especially if we are, and I hate phrasing it this way, but there's not really a better way to do it. But if we are turning culture into a commodity, then people expect things, even if those things that they expect are really, really, really wrong. And so yeah, like with my community, it's all about putting on feathers, putting on animal skins, and those weren't things we ever did. And sure, it can bring in tourism money. It can bring in some tourists who are expecting that thing, but there needs to be a longer a dialogue with those stereotypes, addressing those stereotypes in order to move away from them, because moving away from those stereotypes is impossibly important. It's impossibly for everyone involved, for the for Indigenous people who, we have kind of a saying that if I go to university, I'm going to stop being an Indian, and that's a good thing somehow. So like for my community, because I have doctorates, I'm not I wouldn't necessarily be identified as being a member of my community. And that's a brutal and very a kind of end of game kind of thing to say, that concept to have. But this comes from a lot of the packaging that if you are indigenous, you're bad. Like where I come from, we have the word hincho, which is a slang for Indian, and we just casually use it for someone who's a bad person. Like to this day, it's still used. And so if we can make ourselves very visible and move away slowly from those stereotypes, but forcefully as well, then we can start to open up the options of how we want to talk about ourselves, how we want to have the world see us. And I think it's a very long-term process, of course, but continuing just to go with the stereotypes year in and year out isn't sustainable. It's not a solution for Indigenous people's emotional health, mental health, not for our, for our cultures in the end, for our longevity, and for showing us as being, we're modern people. We live in the modern world, and we're not stuck in a time capsule. So feeding into stereotypes that show us off as that and showing us in ways that we aren't or have never been doesn't help anyone, even if in the short term it might get some tourism money. So it's about having these long discussions of reevaluating how the communities want people to be seen as modern Indigenous people.
Thank you, Paul Albert. Now we have to go to our break. Tony will share a video from Galileo Foundation, which also will be a bit of an introduction to our next guest after the break, Susan Svari. I leave you to it, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah.